So that's 1,000,000 acres around this country that is being put aside.
You are looking at 10,000 kilotons in the difference between what's currently reported as emissions from cattle and what maybe is closer to a more accurate figure. Absolutely, when you start talking about carbon taxes of €101 a tonne, it's a huge thing. It must be remembered that at the moment the EPA have zero accountability. They cannot be sued. They cannot be touched. They cannot be legally held accountable in any direction. And that is a huge problem for us going forward.
Just farmers know that. Just farmers know that anaerobic digesters, if you create electricity from obviously the methane from it, that will go to the energy side.
My name is John Maloney. I'm Vice Chairman with the Beef Plan Movement, and I'm joined by Emmanuel O'Dea and Eamon Corley from the Beef Plan Movement as well. We're discussing the overestimation of agricultural emissions tonight. We're joined by Nadaline Webster, who is the co-founder of the Carbon Removal Action Group. Nadaline has authored this book, a very good book. It's called Flawed Figures and Fragile Futures. And I think many farmers will be flabbergasted by just how much our emissions are being overestimated. And next we have Michael Fitzmaurice, who is a TD with Independent Ireland, and he represents the Roscommon Galway constituency. So, Michael, just to start with you, why do you feel this is an important issue for farmers? I know you've been very active in this area for a good few years, and you've highlighted this in the Dáil on several occasions. Why do you feel this is an important issue that farmers should be active on?
Well, the first thing we have to do is put everything in pretty basic, straight language. Figures or stats or whatever, it's hard to get people engaged. But there's a reality here that with the way they talk about emissions and this needs to be cut and that needs to be cut, it's going to be the future of farming in relation to their stocking rates, all the basically at the moment farmers are classed as being the bad people of this world, which I don't agree with. But like every report you see in media, there's one agenda and that's it. And if we're ever we have to go and show the facts, because if you're building a house, when you're building the house, you need a proper foundation. And one example, and I'll put it pretty simple. Does every farmer realize in this country that's listening to this podcast, do they realize that outside of Quilcha Forest, right, that outside of the old oak forest, that not one tree on their farm or not one tree on any road they go up and down has been included, or not one hedge round houses or round in houses in cities, not one of them has been included in basically what we put one against the other. And I know that Nadaline has done a huge amount of work in basically methane and all the different figures and what cows do. We see it ourselves. We don't have to, like, one thing has come out on the export to slurry. Have a look at how it has changed in the equivalence in 1 year. I think off the top of my head, and you could tell me if I'm right or wrong, it was like 5.2, and now it's down to 2.3 or 4, which I do think might change to about 3 or 3.2. But that's an awful difference when you were talking about either someone was being crucified 10 years ago or it's not right at the moment. So you have to get the stats. On top of that, the amount of peatland in the country has changed now on the figures compared to what the EPA was doing. Now, we have to remember one thing, that at the moment, the EPA are the god of Ireland's emissions in the line of print and everything. And in my opinion, and I'm saying this very bluntly, they have stats and facts which are very questionable. There's no accountability in the line of if something is wrong. So I'll give you an example. The amount of peatland that was being added up a few years ago now appears to be completely wrong by, I don't know, is it 30, 40, 50, 60%. Well, if that was wrong, who's accountable for it? And we need to make sure before we, every day, day in, day out, we see it on television, on papers, and everything. Agriculture, agriculture, agriculture. Everyone is willing to do their bit. But let's know what's the bit you have to do, rather than throwing figures and then to be found that they're not accurate enough. And I'll be honest with you, as you've said already, the question was asked. I asked the question, why can't we put all these trees right around the country? And there's vast amount of them. Have a look at Space for Nature that is being put in, that every farmer on their BIS scheme had to fill. And you had to have a minimum requirement of 10% and 98% of farmers qualified on that, right? And that's be it drains or be it hedges or hedgerows or whatever. So that's 1 million acres around this country that is being pushed aside. But there seems to be no recognition for it. But when you're doing something, no matter what it is, be it dairy stock, dry suckler stock, dry stock, sheep or whatever, you need to have accurate figures. And what we were using and are using, from my understanding, is stuff from other countries that hasn't been basically fact-checked. And we need to make sure that before we're, there's a fact here. If you look at the headlines on some of the papers of some of the people that believe on how to save the world, that they'd be in favour of getting rid of 2/3 of our herd. Well, the facts are that we're probably one of the most efficient at doing it. And the facts are that are we going to send that off? If you look at Brazil, that's going to increase in the next 7 years by more than our national herd. Think of that, more than our national herd. And we're on about crucifying farmers here. So, no, farmers are willing always to play their part. Let everyone be clear on that. Farmers are always willing to try new technologies. Farmers are always willing, if there's new ways of doing something, they will be first in the queue to do it. But don't go kicking the daylights out of them with, in my opinion, not accurate information. And you need to basically have all that fact checked.
Yeah, I know Nadaline, in her book there, she pointed out about there could be issues with lending to farmers if they're regarded as high emitters. Could you just explain a bit of that, Nadaline?
There's a number of, I suppose, plans in place for farmers. And while the finance one is always the scariest one, it doesn't travel on its own. So the United Nations formed a number of alliances within different sectors globally. And the core principle of these alliances is that these companies will decarbonize their client portfolios. And what that means is that they will stop providing services to high emitting sectors. These alliances include law firms in terms of who they provide representation to, insurance companies, investment companies, and as you say, most critically, from the point of view of Ireland's farmers today at least, finance companies. So what that's going to mean is how we are measured and the figures that are reported to represent our emissions will dictate whether or not a bank will decide to lend to us. For example, if you're going to undergo a dairy expansion, from as early as next year, these banks have committed to not providing those services to high emitting, and each and every one of these alliances includes specifically agriculture. So there is no notion, people kind of thought that we were saved by Article 2 of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which said that food security must be a top priority. But I think that food production has undergone a shift in what that means. I mean, food production now could mean a dairy farmer in County Cork. It could also mean Bill Gates breeding bugs to beat the band or creating lab-grown meat in California. So, you know, how food production is defined, what we want from the future, all of that is really not in our hands. And the United Nations is driving a great deal of initiatives and alliances that are going to refuse services specifically to farmers. The legal representation one is not one that scares farmers as much as it should. In the proposal for the Industrial Emissions Directive, and also in the initial proposal for the Nature Restoration Law, it was sought to create a right standing for environmentalists to sue individual farmers. So where you have you know, an increasing trend for looking for the ability to sue individual farmers and at the same time looking to take away access to representation, that's quite scary also. But most immediately, I think, is that Rabobank have made a big commitment to decarbonising their client portfolio, and they're a significant provider of funds to cattle farmers in the Republic of Ireland.
Yes. Yeah, so that makes it pretty important that we get the emissions right. Just going into the emissions themselves and how they're overstated. I know that you might explain this a little bit better, just how the metric for CO2 equivalent for methane, how is that overstated by the IPCC?
Sorry, John, just 1 second, just to follow up on some examples to Michael's points earlier. He was talking about the overstatement of calculations, and I suppose we rely on scientific bodies like Teagasc, for example, to try and establish what is the case in Ireland and what are the emissions in Ireland. And I'm not talking about I'm not going to cut across Nadaline's expertise as regards to the calculations accepted by the international bodies, but what Teagasc have already announced so far this year. So, for example, when it comes to the emissions from reclaimed bogland, what that was based on was on pristine, bogs in Germany, and the rewetting, the concept of rewetting, these bogs and what they will save from the point of view of the reduction in the CO2 that's been emitted. Now, the reality is that there's no such thing as a dry bog in this country. Like, you look at August just gone by, or prime month, and it's probably one of the wettest, definitely one of the 130, 140% of the rainfall in Mayo. There was no, unwetted bog in Mayo for the last 30, 40 days. The reality is that in Ireland, you don't get bogs to actually go to the level that they were testing against in Germany. And the consequence of that is that the bogs that are drained in Ireland don't create half the amount of emissions. And Teagasc have actually come out and they've established that what has been calculated for bogland is not accurate in the Irish scenario because of the amount of rain we get. The other thing that they've established as well is they're already on the early doors as regards to research into the emissions from our national herd, and they're already identifying that on cows on pasture, particularly dairy cows, research on pasture is way lower than what's been reported internationally. So what we're being measured on doesn't stack up to what is actually been recorded now by scientific bodies in Ireland, and that's a positive thing. And that's before you get into what Natalie's going to get into here, which is the whole convoluted way, or the very inaccurate way in which they actually attribute emissions in general, difference between methane and CO2.
Just one thing there, just to give to be accurate in what we're saying in the line of Teagasc. What Teagasc has stated is that the amount of peat soil has been overstated, or drained peat soil has been overstated, because obviously there was some sort of maps that were going by, and now that land would be a different, it might be blackish soil, but it wasn't a peaty soil, and they're saying that was overstated by a lot. That's the first thing. The second thing is, I do think, in reference to a point made earlier, under the Nature Restoration Law, I think that piece has been taken out, if I'm correct.
Yes.
Where someone can object. But I think it's, for anybody in political circles in Ireland, regardless of who you are, I think it's very important that it's a red line issue, that it's enshrined in law, that no farmer on their private property under the nature restoration law would be forced, and this needs to be enshrined. There's no point in talking and saying, it won't happen, because
100%.
I'm old enough to remember, and I've lived through the whole of the Habitats Directive from beginning to end. And I have documents here that anyone can see when a certain politician said that farmers would be paid for every bit of ground they had in designated SAC area, and that it wouldn't affect. I remember at the time saying it was never going to affect turf cutters. Well, it was a fair change that 10 years later those helicopters and Gardaí driving into bogs was a fair change from hearing that. But this is why I'm saying it needs to be enshrined in law that these people that are saying what they're saying today, that won't affect you. Well, let's make sure, because that's the only way you'll do it. If you enshrine it in law that it won't, that no farmer will be basically compulsified, or that it'll be completely voluntary. And the other part that needs to be also put in is that if some farmer decides to do something with their land, if there was some scheme or whatever down the line, that they cannot affect the well-being or the land beside them belonging to somebody that's not participating in it. And I think that's a very important part of the nature restoration law.
I think, just to briefly touch on a couple of things there, I think it's really important to recognise that support for the nature restoration law was justified by the high peatland emissions of Ireland. To my understanding and in my opinion, the nature restoration law has really very little to do with some well-meaning goal for nature restoration, and is in fact designed to increase carbon sequestration by the back door. The EU have made a legally binding commitment to creating 310 million tonnes of carbon removals. Ireland is part of that, and the nature restoration is a big sort of arm of that machine. And it's important to note then that when support for a law is based on figures that later turn out to be wrong, well, you still have the law. It is passed now, and it really doesn't matter what it was justified on. So farmers need to understand that they need to start engaging with complex metrics, maybe numbers that they really don't understand. To Michael's point earlier about, farmers are generally willing. Myself and Roy went to the Groundswell Festival in the UK this summer, and I'm looking around at all the tents, and I'm looking at the thousands of farmers who paid absolute fortunes to be there, who are enthusiastically participating in so many different lectures, different schemes, different techniques, trialing different machinery, trialing out different kinds of supplements and what have you. And it's all, this regenerative agriculture. And I had a meeting with the organisers, and I asked them, where is the reward for all of this built into the systems that you're dealing with? And they said, well, there's the problem. So they can increase the carbon in the soil, they can increase biodiversity, they can lower, the impact and compaction on the land, they can do all kinds of things. But no systems exist to either recognise or reward the things that they're doing right now. And they're not even planned, really. And the same is true for Ireland. There's a vague hand-waving about things, but to totally support Michael's position, if it's not enshrined in law, it doesn't exist. Said is no good to farmers anymore. And I think if there's any farmers who believe that a handshake deal is worth anything to us anymore, then I think you're incredibly naive. I will just swing back to John's question in relation to calculations and the EPA. So it's important to understand that the international calculations and what the EPA do are inextricably interlinked. The EPA follow the IPCC guidelines in putting things together. And then Chagas perform research that helps us to get better and refine those inventory calculations. But we are all the time running into the brick wall of the EPA whether intentionally or not. I won't make any assertions in that regard. But for example, 2 things were accepted into the inventory to the best of my knowledge this summer. One was a reduction in the estimated volume of methane, and the other was the reduction in the estimated peatland emissions. Now, the problem is that our methane figures, after what should have been an almost 17% reduction, are the same as they were previously after that reduction was applied. And I haven't had the opportunity to drill into it sufficiently yet, but it seems to be that what the EPA are saying is that overarching reduction based on Chagas's research was overtaken by an increase of both volume and age of dairy cows. I find that difficult to fit in my head, and it doesn't make any sense to me, and I can't comment on it too much further because I haven't dug into it. But at the same time, the reduction in peatland emissions has been estimated based on Chagas's research, and that has resulted in a massive drop in peatland emissions. The results of Chagas research in relation to cattle emissions has been incorporated into the inventory and has resulted in no drop. And I think that needs robust investigation. And it's something that should be an extreme focus of every farming group that has anything to do with cattle at all. And to revert to Michael's point, it must be remembered that at the moment, the EPA have zero accountability. They cannot be sued. They cannot be touched. They cannot be legally held accountable in any direction. And that is a huge problem for us going forward. The figures that emerge from there will impact every single facet of farming life, from your reputation to how you're talked to in the media, the income that you're allowed to earn, the use that you're allowed to put your private property to, and your entire future. It is beyond belief that cannot be challenged if those figures aren't correct or are problematic in some way. So to really briefly touch on the key points that affect livestock farmers from the IPCC guidelines. The first is estimation. So the first thing that happens is countries estimate the volume of actual methane that's produced. And the techniques to do that, if you will, come in 3 tiers. So you have tier 1, which is just total international default figures. So you've got 10 cows at this age, 10 cows at that age, 10 heifers, 10 bullocks, and you multiply that by standard emission factors. That's your figure. That becomes the reality. As time goes by, though, the likes of Chagas will do research and they'll start adding in more detail and fine-tuning each of those groupings. So, you'll distinguish between dairy cows and suckler cows. You'll distinguish between breed types, health, the age of the animal, the diet. All of these things impact on methane production. So in Ireland, for cattle at least, I don't believe we are for other livestock, but for cattle at least, we are at tier 2. Now, tier 1 estimates are expected to be anywhere up to 50% out. Tier 2 are expected to be anywhere up to sort of 20%, plus or minus either side. So there is a built-in uncertainty into the different tiers. Tier 3 then requires a great deal of intensive research. And I don't believe that we're anywhere even approaching tier 3. But tier 3, according to the IPCC, should be where you're now actually talking somewhat accurate figures. And we are a long, long way from there. So one of the questions that I would have is that given that we signed up to this in 1992 and reconfirmed that in all of the things all along the way, and we knew that we had no ability, no facilities, no sufficient research, nothing done, why was there no investment in that? We were going to be measuring all of these things that are incredibly complex and difficult to measure. It's fairly easy to measure the emissions from a car. It's not so easy to measure them from a cow. And we only started getting concerned about this about 12 years ago, really. And the funding for Chagas to do this work had been very, very slow in coming. So I think a lot of pressure needs to be brought to bear on improving that first one. That estimation of the volume of methane emitted is your base figure, which then goes through a number of processes. So improving that is very much lying in the hands of Teagasc. We need the research to refine all those figures, and then that research gets peer reviewed, and then it is accepted or not by the EPA, who are entitled to make that decision. So that's the process there. The next problem that we have is that the IPCC guidelines double count the methane with the CO2 that actually converts into methane. And it's a complicated enough kind of piece to explain, but if I attempt it very simply, CO2 is taken from the atmosphere by grass, stored in the grass. The cow eats the grass. That mixes with oxygen, converts back to CO2, some of that carbon is stored in her body in meat, muscle, milk, and then is released into the atmosphere when we consume it. But probably about 50% of what the cow takes in is released back almost immediately in respiration mixed with oxygen. And then a small percentage, less than 3% of what she takes in, converts to methane in the gut. And what the IPCC say is, well, we don't count CO2 from cattle because on an annual basis, what went up is what came down. So annual net CO2 emissions from cattle are net zero. But that can't be true because some of that converts to methane. So what gets returned to the atmosphere is actually less than what was taken from the atmosphere. So if you're going to take CO2 and methane separately, and you're going to count them separately and treat them separately, then what you actually have is a small removal of CO2 and a small emission of methane. And that needs to be brought into the calculation. And in case you think, well, that's quite a small figure, it is per cow. Multiplied by every cow in the world, that's a much bigger figure. Multiplied by, a proposed carbon tax on livestock emissions of 101 euros a tonne, that's an enormous figure. So again, getting really interested in the detail on this is really quite important. And then you have the third one, which is the multiplier. And the multiplier is again critically important. So back in 1992, when they signed up to all of this, they didn't come away from it saying, we need to immediately start reducing emissions. What they came away from it saying is, we need to find a way to compare these gases to each other. We need like a currency converter between CO2 and methane and nitrous oxide, because otherwise they can't be traded. Now, I think it's very telling that what they did spend 30 years doing first is building a very complex international emissions and removals trading system between governments before they ever got around to reducing anything, which seems a strange prioritization to me. But nonetheless, this is what happened. So they went to the IPCC and they said, okay, we need a conversion between CO2 and methane and the other greenhouse gases so that, we can find a single figure. So the IPCC tried to sort of say, well, this is incredibly difficult to do because, CO2 lasts thousands of years and methane is quite warming, but it only lasts a short period of time. And, you can't really compare the two things. And they came up with a system called GWP 100, more as an illustration of how very, very difficult it is to do this than any kind of proposed solution. And it is widely reported, I can't swear to its accuracy, but it is widely reported that the response of COP looking at this illustration of how difficult, nigh impossible it is to compare these gases went, that's awesome, let's do that. So when this illustration was presented, you had GWP 20, GWP 100, and GWP 500, which says, look at these gases, the warming from these gases compared over 20 years, look at the warming from these bunch of gases compared over 100 years, and look at it over 500 years. And so obviously over 20 years, methane looks much, much worse. over 100 years, you know, you're starting to find a little bit of parity, and over 500 years, the CO2 starts to look a great deal more warming than the methane. And I suppose if you looked at it over 1,000 years, the methane warming from methane might be completely insignificant. So the system that we have for creating a CO2 equivalent for methane is completely arbitrary. And it is not, in fact, you will hear people say, oh, methane is 28 times more warming than CO2. It isn't. That is not, GWP 100 is not an actual statement of the amount of warming produced by methane versus CO2. It is a protocol equivalent. It is an equivalency created between the two of them to facilitate the Kyoto Protocol. That is all. As a straight comparison, methane is actually 80 times more warming than CO2. But seen through the lens of GWP 100, it is currently considered to be 28. And what's really important to realize there is that that multiplier is a movable feast. As the volume of CO2 rises in the atmosphere, or greenhouse gases generally, that multiplier will continue to rise. It started at 21. I think it was 2022, it was 25, now we're at 28, and it will continue to go up. So even though your actual volume of methane that is emitted might go down, your reported CO2 equivalent emissions could go up. Because while you reduce the amount of methane, COP increased the multiplier. And that's a huge problem. But it's not the only problem with multiplier. In the AR6, the IPCC stated themselves that the use of GWP 100 overstates the warming impact of methane from cattle by 300 to 400%, and simultaneously understates the warming impact of methane from fossil fuels by 400 to 500%. So cattle is multiplied by 28, which is 3 to 4 times too much, and fossil fuels are multiplied by 28, which is 3 or 4 times too little. If you change the multiplier, even, you know, there's a number of phenomenal climate scientists, including Professor Miles Allen at Oxford University. He has proposed a different system called GWP star, and there is in fact a direction of travel that this will be adopted, and it will significantly change the metrics in relation to methane from cattle. But we could be looking at 10 years before that happens, unless, of course, we get behind these scientists and really start engaging, getting interested in this, and demanding and driving political change. But in the intervening period, I'm not understanding what the argument is against implementing the IPCC's own findings. So if you say the figure of 28 is 3 to 4 times overstating the case, overstating the warming of cattle, well, why not just divide that by 3 or 4? Why not have a multiplier of 8 for cattle, and then do the same the other end with fossil fuels, which I think will give you a multiplier of 126. And now the CO2 equivalent that we're reporting now, today, is actually reflective of the warming that the IPCC have found that these two gases, or these two sources of gases, are creating in the atmosphere. And a key takeaway then is to understand that everybody thinks that the scientists are in charge of all of this. They think, you know, we've got boffins in labs somewhere doing huge work, and, you know, they emerge from a burning lab waving a piece of paper shouting, "Eureka, I have found it," and then that gets implemented. That's not how it works. How it works is the research is done. It's not always unanimously agreed upon, even within the IPCC themselves. There are many scientists. That is the nature of science, and it needs to be that way and will always be that way. and the same applies to Chagas. And when they have findings, they then have to take that through the SBSTA to our government representatives at COP. And our government representatives at COP are the ones who decide what gets incorporated into the inventory and what doesn't. So, for example, as one small example, the IPCC have been saying very frequently over a number of years that when biogenic methane breaks down in the atmosphere, it does not create any additional CO2 because you're literally in a current day cycle. So it's just moving around, but no additional CO2 is created. On the other hand, when you release methane from fossil fuels, it does create additional CO2 when it breaks down, because that CO2 or that methane was converted from carbon millions of years ago and stored geologically. So it's additional to today's current cycle. And so they have argued that where the multiplier for biogenic methane could be 28, and then the multiplier for fossil fuel methane should be 29 to reflect that additional CO2 that's created. And COP have repeatedly ignored it and not implemented it. So any tiny thing that goes towards greater accuracy for farming or for fossil fuels indeed gets completely overridden.
I find that astonishing, because we're always told by environmentalists and policymakers that you have to trust the science. And
yes,
that's the constant line we're fed. But
yes,
from what you're saying, they're not even following the advice of their own scientists, you know?
no.
They've always said that there should be a difference between biogenic methane from cows and methane from fossil fuels.
Yes, the debate rages on as to what those differences should be, but they have argued for a long time that it should be at least one in the difference because of that additional CO2. We count CO2 as one because that's the base gas. So, you know, they create additional CO2, that should be reflected in it. But that's not in the IPCC's hands. That's in the hands of our government representatives. And unless we know about this stuff and start making some noise, none of this is ever going to change. And if it doesn't change, we are in very real bother. If you look at it and say, at the moment, say 2021, right? So the data was that agriculture was responsible for 22, nearly 23 million tons, 22,000 kilotons of CO2 equivalent. Of that, 1.2 million of it was, or almost 1.3, was enteric methane from cattle, okay? Which puts, as you say, cattle squarely in the firing line. When you implement the reductions in the estimation of methane by cattle, you correct for the double counting of the CO2, and you correct for the overstatement of the warming impact reflected in the GWP 100 in your multiplier. That then changes from 12, almost 13,000 kilotons to 1,900 kilotons. If cattle are properly measured between now and 2030, and I'm not looking to be like, oh, let's create this thing that is a get out of jail free card. My position with this book, and John and myself's position at Crag, is very simple. Farmers have a right to be measured accurately, and they should not be penalised for harm they're not doing. Regardless of whether or not my land is useful to you to solve some other problem, that sounds a lot like your problem. And you need to come and negotiate that straight and separately with me. But cattle should only be penalised. Property rights should only be interfered with to the extent of the harm that it's causing. End of story. So then if the environmentalists want to take legal action against the government, and they can, and the court can make an order that the government must do something to meet this thing, with which the government will then have to comply, and we are the obvious targets, then to me, strategically, the way to solve that is to ensure that our numbers are accurate. Because if the numbers for cattle methane are accurate and accurately reflect the contribution to climate change, then the value of getting rid of cattle goes away. A little bit wrong, it's a hell of a lot wrong. And I don't see how we as an industry can outrun that.
And sorry, Nadaline, how do you think farming organisations can go about getting those figures corrected? Is there nothing we can do, or is there something if we all got together? Is there a way of getting them corrected?
I think that there is. So the estimation is a home problem. And one of the things that I think would be really, really helpful is if farming groups got together and massively supported people like Michael Fitzmaurice, who would, the EPA must have accountability. We must be able to take action to improve figures, gain accuracy here at home. That's an absolute necessity, I think. That's, as Michael said, he would have red lines for political parties. These would be my red lines. We must be able to say those figures are wrong. If we can prove that a set of figures are wrong here at home, we must be able to take some kind of action to correct them. And today we can't, our hands are tied. That needs to change. So that's one thing that I would kind of make as a bit of a mission. The second thing is to realize that in relation to the double counting of CO2, that's just plain wrong. When you go into the inventory, there are two statements there made by the IPCC that are wrong, and international pressure needs to be brought to bear to fix that. Is it a small thing? Yes. Across all the global herd, is it a big thing? Absolutely. When you start talking about carbon taxes of 101 euros a tonne, it's a huge thing. So that is something that our elected representatives need to do through COP, and they need to be incentivized to do so. Right now, nobody really knows how the inventory works. Nobody really knows how it's structured. So they get away with saying things and ignoring things and letting things sit. You know, farmers have talked about protesting, and they've talked about what was going on in Amsterdam. Not a huge fan necessarily of protesting, but if you're going to protest, do it for something. Don't protest because you're angry about things. Protest to achieve something. And getting these guys motivated to go to Brazil in 2025 and put motions on the table to have that corrected would be really, really good. Bringing under pressure, waiting 10 years for maybe, you know, GWP star to be implemented, or whatever it is that they're going to do to make it more indicative of the contribution to climate change for both biogenic methane and methane from fossil fuels. That's a death sentence, in my view. Farming groups need to educate themselves as much as possible. They really do need to engage with the material as much as possible. And they need to start, I'll be really clear. If policies are not viable and you as an industry can't survive them, then there's only two options. One is that you can negotiate to change the policies. I think we've all been trying to do that for quite some time. At some point, you might have to accept that you need to change the people at the negotiating table.
Yesterday, there was a controversy where the education, a book for the secondary schools, and it displayed traditional Irish families as like rednecks in iron jumpers with pitchforks and cows, and that they're opposed to change. And that it's a cynicism that they attack the youth, the innocence of youth, and they force them out onto the streets to protest. Like there's no other subject or no other topic that they would actually encourage students to quit school and go and actually protest about. But in this,
and if farmers don't engage, well then, okay, they may go out of business, right? They're getting old, as you say, they've all grey hair. They may very well go out of business if all the EU money is directed to the 20% that do conform.
Richard Linton, sorry. And like his core point is that if you get rid of every cow on the planet, not only every cow, every ruminant on the planet, everything, the most you can expect to save is 0.02 of a degree over the next 50 years.
So
wipe them out.
And it would be overtaken almost immediately by continued fossil fuel emissions.
Absolutely.